What's up, guys? Welcome into the Week 3 edition of Bogey Free for NFL. I am joined, as always, with Steve Halupka at The Real Halupka. And tonight we are actually lucky enough to be joined by a guest, the first one of the NFL season, in Pat James. He's on Twitter at Pat James DFS. You can read his stuff at RotoViz. You can watch his videos on Roster Coach every week. We'll start with you, Pat. How's it going, man?
Good. Just watching the Rams and Niners game here a little bit. Gurley's going ham as we speak. Just getting ready to talk some Week 3 with you guys. Glad to have to be on.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for coming on. And what's going on with you, Steve? How we doing?
I'm doing all right, man. Watching the same. Gurley just dominating life right now, and Carlos Hyde owners are bumming a bit on the sideline with looks like a rib or hip injury.
Yeah, so we'll, as always, there's something odd that happens on a Thursday night. A few weeks ago, it was Alex Smith being Tom Brady and Tom Brady being Alex Smith, and now we have a little sweat with this injury nonsense with Hyde. So hopefully, if you have him somewhere where he'll be back soon. But wanted to quickly go through the listener league from last week. Naturally, Roger freaking took it down again. Luckily, I was able to at least salvage my day with a little bit of a late swap. Although I guess in theory, the late swap kind of screwed me. And I kind of wanted to get your guys' opinion on this while I have some smarter folks than me to talk to. So I had Ty Montgomery in my flex spot, left $100 on the table so I could pivot to Cobb, and did so thinking, all right, at least I'll make up some ground. And then, of course, Cobb doesn't outscore, but I still ended up in second. So I guess Pat, I'll start with you. What are your thoughts on a late swap like that?
Yeah, going by what you said, and I'm guessing you were afraid that you were going to drop out of second place. That's always the risk that you take, because there's going to be players behind you if you're in a GPP that may have the player that you're swapping off of, and they can catch you if you swap to a suboptimal play. And head-to-heads is where you really want to use it the most, because if you can reverse engineer and find out you guys have the same player and you're behind, then it's a no-brainer. But you definitely do run the risk of falling in a GPP if you swap off an optimal play like that.
Yeah, and I think I was in seventh. I left my friend's house at 8 o'clock, got home at like 8:22, and just took all my time on out and split Cobb and Adams, and just was like, you know what, screw it, let's see what happens, see if I can make up some ground on some people, and it ended up. I actually would have, I think, got into first place in this particular contest if I would have went with Adams there, but I ended up with Cobb. I was the only one with Cobb in this whole like 30-man contest. So, Steve, what are your thoughts? Are you on the same board with Pat there?
Yeah, totally. I think in head-to-heads, it really makes a lot of sense sometimes when you can really look at the other guy's roster and determine who exactly they're going to have in what spots. But yeah, GPP is like Pat was saying, you could run some risk of falling back a couple of spots when you shift from a chalkier play to something that's a little bit more risky.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so yeah, we have Raj winning again. I can't bear myself to go through his lineup again this week, so we'll leave it there and just get into week 3, move forward a little bit. And I guess we might as well start with some quarterbacks as usual. We'll start with you, Pat. Where are you leaning for some cash plays this week when it comes to quarterbacks?
Yeah, I think my favorite play is actually going to be Matt Stafford. He's looked great the last 2 weeks. They really didn't need to throw in the second half against the Giants. So I think that might have some people a little bit worried, because he only had about 120 yards or something like that against the Giants. And but Stafford, the Falcons are going to be without Vic Beasley. So I think their pass rush is going to be a little bit weak. And I think Stafford could really pick them apart at home.
Yeah, definitely. I'm definitely interested in that game in a lot of different spots. So I think that's a solid play. Steve, is there anybody else worth consideration in cash in your mind?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're paying up this week in cash, Rodgers is obviously very viable there. I mean, he's near the top, just $400 cheaper than Brady at 7,300, but big time home favorite here against Cincinnati, who still seems a bit beat up, especially in the secondary. We've seen Rodgers rebound off of road games coming back to Green Bay for some really big weeks. So I think if you're paying up, Rodgers, I think is a really good spot there. And then also on the other side of that Detroit Atlanta game, Matt Ryan just seems like the wheels are just completely turning with that offense right now. Even on the road in Detroit, I'm not really afraid of Darius Slay and the rest of that secondary. So I think Matt Ryan for 71 could also be a nice play if you're paying up.
Yeah, absolutely. Outside of that, I mean, I don't think this is necessarily, at least for me, I don't think this is a week where I'm going to try to get too cute with my quarterbacks. I think there's a lot of value elsewhere. And I think that I'm just going to sort of stick mostly to Stafford and Rodgers, like you guys said. Like I said, I don't think there's really much of a reason to vary elsewhere. But of course, in a GPP, we want to differentiate a little bit. So what are we looking at there? Is there just like an outrageous value somewhere that we can sort of target? I guess I'll send it to Pat again.
Yeah, I mean, to add to the cash game, though, I think, not to get off topic, but real quick, I think the primetime game is going to be heavily owned. Kirk Cousins and Derek Carr are both going to have a ton of ownership. Number one, because it's the Sunday night game, and number two, because both defenses look like they are going to give up some points in that game. So I think that I'm personally probably going to lean Stafford, but I wouldn't be surprised if Cousins and Carr have a ton of ownership. Just wanted to get that in there. As for a GPP quarterback, I think there's going to be a ton of ownership on Cam because he's playing the Saints, and like we said, I think there's going to be a ton of ownership on Cousins, Carr, and Stafford. And they're all in that 6K range. I think a good pivot might be Russell Wilson, and I know that he's looked pretty terrible in the first 2 weeks. Couldn't get it done at home against San Fran, so I think you're going to have a lot of people off of him. And there's going to be a week eventually where he gets it rolling, and it could very well be this week against the Titans, who have struggled against the pass so far this season.
Yeah, absolutely. Steve, anybody else jumping out at you as well?
This would be like a 5%er in my GPP lineups, but DeShone Kizer, I know he left the game for a migraine. He's really turned the ball over a bunch also early on, but with how much Cleveland's throwing the deep ball right now against that Indy secondary, who was torched with guys like J.J. Nelson last week against Arizona, plus his rushing upside, I think he might be one, he's definitely going to be low owned. Two, I do think he's got some upside for at least a couple touchdowns, and only 5K leaves you a lot of room with your roster to really bring in some extra studs.
Absolutely. Any love from either of you for Simeon this week?
It's really tough to say it for Simeon. I mean, obviously he's had that hot start. It looks like Marcel Darius might not play up front for Buffalo, so that might be a good thing for them. But coming cross country, man, it's a whole different ball game than playing in the friendly confines of Denver.
Yeah, he also has some crazy stat like 80% of his passes in the red zone have gone for touchdowns thus far this season. So that's something that's going to regress to the mean. And I just think that, as Steve said, on the road against the Bills, the good thing about Simeon is his targets are really concentrated in Emmanuel Sanders and Demaryius Thomas. So it's easy to stack him with his receivers because there's not 100 of them that he can pepper targets to. But I think there's some better options this week.
Yeah, that's fair. And I'm just thinking people will see, his points per game and not necessarily, he's not going to see like some huge share of ownership. But I think people will definitely be willing to claim him after seeing his points per game and everything else. And like sort of in a lower range of your exposure where, you know, you're throwing 20 lineups into, say, the play action. I think he's worth a roster spot or two, just like you mentioned with a stack. I think it could be interesting if he can connect with Sanders or Thomas a couple times. And then outside of that, I mean, for me, I can't really find many darts to throw here outside of those guys. Maybe if you want to throw in some Smoke and Jay, I wouldn't completely fault you, but just because it's the Jets. But yeah, I mean, maybe even, I mean, honestly, the way that the Giants looked, it might even be worth it to have a couple lineups with Wentz as well this week. Because as a Giants fan, I can tell you, if you haven't been watching the games, they're just god awful. Like it's a little scary almost.
Yeah, and to your Giants point, Janoris Jenkins might also not play in this game. So if he doesn't play, Alshon could have a monster day against that secondary.
Yeah, I actually considered Wentz in cash. He finished. I kind of do like a boxes check thing to see how much each quarterback or each player overall meets a criterion for just requirements for a cash game, and he was up there, especially if Jenkins doesn't play. Another dart throw I think I like this week is Andy Dalton. Believe it or not, and speaking of quarterbacks that have been absolutely terrible this year, he's been pretty bad, but they just got a new offensive coordinator in Bill Lazor. The game script is probably going to be in A.J. Green's favor. Everybody's on A.J. Green this week, kind of the squeaky wheel thing. He complained in his presser that he wasn't getting the ball enough. So if A.J. Green's going to be heavily owned, that means that Andy Dalton should be or should have some success at least. So I think that game in general might go a little bit under-owned since it's not one of the highest two total games. So maybe a Dalton Green and then run it back with Tymont and maybe another Green Bay receiver in there.
Yeah, I love that. Absolutely. That's it's so hard. Like I have Andy in season long, and it's just like
I already cut him.
Yeah, I did too this week. I was just like, I'm not even dealing with this anymore. It's so not worth it. All right, so yeah, let's head over to I guess running backs next. We have to talk about the elephant in the room here, right? We got Le'Veon just letting people down left and right. Steve, what are your thoughts this week? Does he bounce back and become the Le'Veon we're used to?
Man, we're hoping. The usage was there last week, which was one of the issues in week one. It just, he really couldn't get things going. I mean, 4 catches, 4 yards, that's not at all what we expect from Le'Veon Bell. And again, they're playing a Chicago team that does have a good front seven. We spoke about this early on, I think in week one, where the front seven is just underrated and their back end's really where they have a lot of issues. So to pay up for $8,800 for him, obviously his prices come down a bit, but I think in cash especially, I think I'm going to fade him.
What about you, Pat?
Yeah, I agree with Steve. They kind of took the training wheels off in week 2. I think they were afraid that he really didn't have much contact all through August. So they were afraid to give him a ton of work. But 30 touches in week 2 is pretty crazy. He had 27 carries and I think 4 targets. So the usage is there. However, at the same time, Chicago hasn't allowed an RB1 since, or they've only allowed 1 or 2 since maybe week 1 or week 2 of last year. So they are really good at stopping the running back. They kind of, as they say in fantasy, quote unquote, funnel action towards the pass. So I wouldn't be surprised if the Steelers' passing game gets going more so than Le'Veon this week.
Yeah, definitely. I'm fully on board with that. I mean, it's just, I mean, his price did come down, which is a little encouraging. And I don't think, I mean, unless he busts this week, I don't think you're going to see him at this low of a price again. I can't remember the last time he was under 9K to begin with. So if you're going to see him at this price with depressed ownership, I mean, this would seem to be the time to buy a couple of shares at least. So as we keep looking, if we take sort of the next 4 guys in a chunk here from 8K to 7K, we got Kareem Hunt, Jay Ajayi, Melvin Gordon, and LaShawn McCoy. I can imagine that one of these guys isn't being touched. But Pat, what are your thoughts on that next group?
I'll be in tournaments. I'll be supremely overweight on Kareem Hunt. On Fanshare Sports, which is a website that kind of aggregates all kinds of start and sit DFS information, he has currently 0 start recommendations. So I really think that, especially being in that tier with the depressed Le'Veon Bell and Jay Ajayi, who has a great matchup against the Jets, Hunt's going to go way under-owned. And right now on Football Outsiders, his offensive line stats are off the charts. They're number 1 in power. They are up there in stuff percentage, which is a stat that basically says they're not allowing penetration, and he's being first contacted after the line of scrimmage. There's just a ton of statistics at Football Outsiders that say his offensive line is doing really well this year so far. And I think that people are going to see also the number 1 next to the Chargers and be a little bit scared of that defense. But in reality, I think it's a farce to this point. So I think Kareem Hunt's a great play.
How about you, Steve? Where are you looking at in this range?
Yeah, I do love Hunt in GPPs especially. I think in cash, Ajayi is probably going to be very chalky this week, playing against the Jets defense that just gave up a 50-yard touchdown run to Cordero Patterson of all people. So, and that was right up the middle too, which I was shocked. So I think Ajayi will be pretty chalky, but I'm digging him definitely in cash games. Melvin Gordon, he's got that guaranteed touch floor, like he's the only show in town. But I think he's probably one of the least optimal options in that tier. And then Shady, I'm just not touching the 10-foot pole right now. Denver's defense is for real yet again, especially their run defense is solidified as well. Even though they are at home, super low total. Just really not feeling LaShawn McCoy at all.
Yeah, definitely. I think that, I mean, I'm a guy that sort of sticks to one cash lineup. And this is those 3 guys, Hunt, Ajayi, and Gordon, are kind of the biggest decision I'm trying to make right now, just because they're so close in price. And I think that realistically, I think that they all have, very similar floors. I'm sort of leaning towards Ajayi just because of just for the Jets. It's the Jets, and I just if you think about what happened last week with Oakland, if they had one running back, right, that would have been a complete mash spot. If you combine all their running back stats, that would have been insane. So that's kind of where I'm leaning there. So as we head down a little bit further, we can kind of go wherever here. What are some of the cheaper options that we're looking at for cash to pair up with maybe Hunt for you, Pat?
Honestly, I don't think there is. I mean, below where we were talking about, I think Ty Montgomery is going to be another cash lock for me this week. There were some reports that he might have his touches reduced a little bit, but honestly, I can't see them giving Jamal Williams a ton of carries. So I think Ty even at $1,000 more, I think he just is too involved in the pass game. So on a site like DraftKings with PPR, he's going to mash again. So I think pretty much for me, it's just lock Montgomery and Ajayi into those first 2 RB spots.
Okay. And how about you, Steve?
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely a big fan of Timeout Awesome this week. Like I said, 9-point favorite at home really kind of checks a couple boxes in that instance. If you're looking to get cute, I think Amir Abdulah's got some real upside this week. We saw him actually run effectively against the Giants at $4,700. He is at home, and we do know that Atlanta does give up the most yardage to receiving running backs. And we saw him actually get a ton of snap count as well. wasn't just the Theo Riddick show as well on second and third down. So if you're looking for to save some money at running back, I could see Abdullah getting a ton of work here.
Yeah. Speaking of Ajayi too, he last week at least, I know it's a small sample, only one game for the Dolphins thus far, but he only came off the field for 4 of 68 snaps. So he's going to get the work. The touches will be there for him. Even on like obvious passing downs, 3rd and long, he was still on the field, which was a change from last year. So that's encouraging, especially against the Jets team that, I mean, they should just trounce.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so if we're paying up for running backs in cash this week, are there any GPP worthy guys a little bit cheaper that you're targeting, or is this just sort of a just pay up for running back everywhere and just find the values at wide receiver and tight end for you, Steve?
I do think there's a couple options. I hate to say it, but I'm going to have at least a couple of shares of Isaiah Crowell. I know I've been talking a lot about the Cleveland Browns this show, and I'm not sure why,
yes.
but it's just the Indianapolis defense has been so putrid the first couple of weeks. I know it's a super low total at 40.5 right now, but that offensive line is better than people are giving it credit so far this season. And Crowell is just missing some of these big runs, and that Indy defense is just so bad. Like, I know Carson Palmer didn't look great, but at the same time, I think they're going to have a real shot at making some plays in terms of the Browns in Indy this week. So I would say Isaiah Crowell for 4,800 is not a bad name. I wouldn't really venture too far past that in terms of dollar value. Going above that, if maybe I'll have one GPP lineup in with Derrick Henry, just because I don't think DeMarco Murray's playing this week. I know it's a tough spot, but he is home. Playing against a Seattle defense that is shockingly really bad against the run so far this season. We saw Carlos Hyde tear him up last week, and we do know the Tennessee offensive line is one of the top 5 units in the league right now. So I will probably have one lineup with Derrick Henry just to be a bit contrarian.
And Steve, you don't have to apologize for touting Crowell here. Come on, like that's my guy. So you're in. I have no problem with that at all. Pat, is there anybody else that's jumping out to you down here as a value?
Yeah, below Isaiah Crowell, I think there's 2. And DraftKings is tight this week. FanDuel's always a little bit looser than DraftKings, but both have done a pretty good job of pricing up. But DraftKings is super tight. I think Darren Sproles against the Giants. It seems to me that the Garrett Blount's an afterthought, and Philly is throwing the ball like crazy. They just don't have a run game. They can't get it going with Blount or Smallwood. So I think Sproles will be on the field for a lot of the snaps, and I think that he, at the salary that he is, he's a pretty good option. And Mark Ingram as well is pretty depressed for being the starting running back. I know they're getting Alvin Kamara in the line in the game a lot, and also Adrian Peterson's choking Sean Payton in an effort to get in the game too. So there's guys breathing down Ingram's neck, but at 4,500, he's involved in the passing game. He's their starting running back as of right now, and he'll probably get the goal line work. So at 4,500 on DraftKings, I think Mark Ingram and Sproles are the plays if you're going to go that low.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think it is worth, especially in GPPs like we're talking about now. I think it is worth a couple of darts down here, just because I do think that lineup construction this week is going to be heavily tilted towards paying up for running backs, even if that doesn't include Le'Veon Bell, which is kind of a weird thought to have. But even if they don't go that high, I still think most lineups are going to have Hunt, Ajayi, or Gordon. So I think it's definitely worth differentiating there every so often. I do think that those guys at the top are good plays though. So don't go too crazy and just fade them outright. All right, so let's head over to wide receivers, because if we're paying up for all these running backs, we're definitely going to need to find some cheaper options at wide receiver. And I guess we can I'm gonna assume. I mean, Jordy practiced today, as far as I know. Um, I'm gonna just go ahead and say that there's almost no way that I'm gonna play him, even if he does play. I think I'd like to just wait a week and see what happens there. But say Evans, Green, Beckham, Brown, and Jones. If you are paying up for wide receiver, is there a favorite there for you, Pat?
Yeah, I mentioned before, I really think it's AJ Green. He's in a plus matchup against Green Bay. His home road splits actually favor when he's on the road, and the squeaky wheel theory is in effect, as he's been complaining that he hasn't gotten the targets. Bill Lazor, new offensive coordinator, said he wants to get the ball out of Dalton's hands a little bit quicker and then take some shots down the field. So I think we could see some bubble screens and maybe a deep shot or two for AJ Green. I think he's probably my favorite play over 7K or so. But that said, I'm probably not going that high in cash.
Absolutely. How about you, Steve? Is there besides AJ? Because I saw you nodding your head there. Besides AJ, is there a guy that you're going to be targeting up here?
Yeah, AJ is definitely my favorite as well. AJ normally doesn't speak out at all, so again, kind of squeaky wheel theory. The only one I would think of above 7K would be Keenan Allen potentially for cash. Since he's been back, he's just been again that target hog in LA. I almost said San Diego. In LA, 10 targets last week. Really just being that steady possession receiver, and he's scoring touchdowns too. And most of the time, he's not going to be lining up against Marcus Peters, so that's always a good thing too when you're playing the Chiefs. Pretty solid over/under for this game at 47.5. So kind of digging Keenan Allen at 7,200. But other than that, yeah, you got to go pretty cheap at receiver this week.
Yeah, and I mean, if we're talking GPPs, because I'm with you guys on I'm paying up for running back in cash, but if we're talking GPPs, I like Julio quite a bit this week as well. I know he's on the road, but he's on turf, so I don't really care. I think that he's going to be in a good spot, and I think he's going to be super under-owned for sort of his ceiling that he can give you in a GPP. So I'm definitely going to have some lineups where I'm paying all the way up there for Julio. But then as we go through a little bit further down beyond 7K and get into some of these value guys, who are we locking in for cash under 7K? What's the move here, Pat?
My favorite under 7K, who I think is a lock, and I've actually around the industry I've seen some dissenting opinions, but for me it's DeAndre Hopkins. He has had 29 targets in 2 weeks, so they're basically feeding him the ball. Houston's playing pretty fast, which they tend to always do with Bill O'Brien as the head coach. New England's playing pretty fast. The game script kind of favors a pass-heavy attack, as the Patriots are probably going to be leading in the second quarter by a good margin. So I think they're going to have to probably throw every play. And the thing with Hopkins is he doesn't have to be efficient. If he's going to get 14 or 15 targets, which is his average through 2 games, he only has to catch about half of those to pay off 6.2K salary, I believe it is. So I think that Hopkins is probably my lock for cash.
Yeah, that's fair. How about you, Steve?
Yeah, I mean, Hopkins is a really good one. Double-digit targets are almost a certainty there. Someone I'm certainly looking forward to potentially rostering again this week. Adam Thielen at 5,700. This might end up being kind of a lower-owned game overall. But if Sam Bradford plays, I mean, it's a very concentrated target share between him and Stephon Diggs at receiver. We know those are going to be the only 2 guys getting the ball from Sam Bradford, who is just scary efficient when he's in the lineup. And also don't forget, Tampa Bay's corners are pretty awful as well, especially on the outside. Brent Grimes and Vernon Hargreaves both under a 50 grade according to PFF, and coming out of the slot. Their corner there as well has not been graded too strongly per Pro Football Focus. Geez, if I could speak tonight. Holy crap. So, yeah, I mean, I'm digging Adam Thielen as well at 57. To go super deeper than that, gosh, I hate bringing up the damn Cleveland Browns, but, I mean –
Did you move to Cleveland since
No, dude,
since
I
last
didn't,
week?
but
Jeez.
I feel like there's so much value this week against the Colts. The culture is such a terrible team overall, but Rashard Higgins for 4K, like, Kenny Britt doesn't want to play football anymore. There's really – Corey Coleman's hurt. There's no one else to really catch the ball there for Kaiser, so coming off a really strong game, I think Higgins has a nice floor. And for 4K, again, it's going to save you some cash to pay up for a running back, so I'm cool with it.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that he's obviously going to be pretty popular. Just looking around and seeing who people are talking about this week, I think that Higgins is definitely going to have some ownership, and it's one of those situations where you have if he busts, then everybody's going to be like, "You're an idiot. You played a Cleveland wide receiver. Like, what are you doing?" And if he hits, then obviously everybody knew that he got 11 targets last week.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there's no way that you can sort of feel completely right after playing him either way. But and I'm going to backtrack to running backs real quick. I mean, if Britt really isn't going to be involved, and let's say Higgins isn't necessarily what we thought he was, is it worth looking at Duke Johnson for some leverage here against the ownership of Higgins, do you think, Pat?
Yeah, sure. I mean, he's made some pretty spectacular catches through 2 weeks. I think the thing is, I don't know Kaiser's propensity to target the running backs. I think he's thrown like the most deep passes in the league to this point in the year. So I think he's just unloading, and I'm not really sure. See, here's the thing with running backs for me in tournaments. I really like to keep a low concentration of running backs. I keep my pool of running backs pretty shallow, and I also try to keep the value at wide receiver in my GPP. So I'm usually not going to roster someone like Duke Johnson just because the odds of him going bananas are pretty low.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's fair. Another guy who I have been sort of bouncing back and forth with cash would be just looking at Jarvis Landry, seeing 15 targets last week. 6,800 is sort of, I mean, it's sort of like the top. If he was 6K or like 5,800, I think he would be like wild chalk this week. Any thoughts on the Miami pass catchers, Steve?
I'm more in favor of Devontae Parker this week, to be honest. I know Landry saw a ton of targets, but he wasn't playing against Casey Hayward like Parker was last week. So I'm more excited about Devontae Parker, even with some of the volume that Landry did get. And I also don't think they'll need to utilize that short passing game to move the ball, where they'll be able to really pound Jay Ajayi and then go up top to Devontae Parker against whatever secondary is out there for the Jets.
Yeah, I think that's fine too. I mean, Parker, what did Parker see? 9 targets last week. So, it's not like he was just a couple of deep shots and see you later, which I think maybe some people would have projected for him. It seems like Cutler's looking for him as well. So it will be interesting to see how the Miami wide receivers sort of shake out as we move forward in the Jay Cutler era down in Miami. And then outside of that, I mean, are there any other dart throws that you're really considering down here? Like I don't know, say like some of these just super boomer bust guys, say like Deshaun Jackson, maybe. Any thoughts there for you, Pat?
Yeah, I like Jackson. I think he always has. Conversely to what I was saying about Duke Johnson, Deshaun Jackson always has a chance to be the hammer with the type of targets that he gets. I think Devin Funchess is an interesting play with Greg Olsen on the shelf. That whole Carolina passing attack just kind of gets a bump in targets with Benjamin McCaffrey, Funches, they all should get some increased looks. So I think anywhere where you're seeing increased looks that probably weren't priced into the algorithm, you could take a shot. Like Higgins too. Higgins is definitely going to be chalky because he's going to see a ton more snaps with Coleman out.
Yeah, definitely. Steve, is there anybody else worth talking about as we go lower?
Yeah, I'm trying to find the rest of the Cleveland Browns, but no. The only one I could potentially think of, and this is like a 1% play if you're throwing a ton of GPP lineups in, potentially Deontay Thompson from Chicago playing against Pittsburgh should have a pretty negative game script, so they'll be throwing the ball a ton there for Chicago. Saw a bunch of targets last week from Mike Glennon, even though we think Glennon isn't the best quarterback in the world. But we know Kendall Wright's there and Terry Cohen, but I think the touchdown maker there will be Deontay Thompson.
Okay, great. All right, Pat, if that's good for you, we can head over to tight ends.
Yeah, sure, let's do it.
All right. So we have a sort of injured but not injured, but he's fine and he might still be hurt, but we're not really sure. Gronk at 6,800. Is he even? I'm just having flashbacks to last year. I think it was last year against Houston when he came back finally. I think it was like week 5 or something like that. And he came out for like 2 plays in the red zone and didn't play the rest of the game. So I'm having season-long flashbacks to Gronk against Houston. But Pat, are you touching Gronk in any situation?
No, thanks. No. Anytime that there's a soft tissue injury like that, especially with Gronk, who has always the risk of re-injury, I think that you're pretty safe because you don't want a guy like that to wreck your lineup with limited playing time or a re-injury, especially if he is iffy to play right up until game time.
Yeah, and Steve, I saw you shaking your head. You're in the same boat there.
Yeah, totally off Gronk. I think we hit our Gronk lineup last week, so we got enough of him for the season.
Perfect. And then obviously Ertz is just continuing to be made of pure calcium. This week again, he's 5K. He saw a little bit of a price drop. I think he was 54, 55-ish last week. And he's going against my just putrid Giants. The way to attack them is pretty much anyway, but I think tight end is even worse for them right now. So, is there any situation where you're fading him, Pat?
No, I think Ertz is in the perfect spot for me. He's probably my top cash game tight end, even though it's a pay up, and I usually like to pay down at tight end. Like you said, the Giants, they just got smashed by Witten, smashed by Ebron. They're just notorious tight end. And Philly loves to target Ertz. Wentz and Ertz have had a great chemistry through 2 weeks. He hasn't scored yet, but I think that's going to change this week.
Okay, and speaking of Ebron, he did find the box last week. Steve, if you're paying down, are you looking at Ebron, or is there somebody else that's catching your attention down there?
Yeah, under 4K. I mean, we do have Hunter Henry who finally looked to be ascending above Antonio Gates for a week. So
yeah, he was there, right? I guess he actually showed up to the stadium last week, so that was nice.
Football, so that was exciting. The guy I'm really looking at, if you're going under 4K though, Jack Doyle. Jacoby Brissett just loved to target Jack Doyle last week. A ton of work there. And of course, we know Cleveland's not the best secondary in the world either. My only worry is, again, that this low total at 40 points can scare some people off, but I do think the volume is there for him. And we've seen him do it against much better defenses already. So Doyle will be my under 4K play if I'm going that low.
All right. I've been sort of, I mean, I said it last week, and it wasn't optimal clearly, but I do kind of like Jared Cook this week. Higher total, I think maybe not necessarily a cash play, but that game is going to be very high owned in general. So I don't know how high his ownership can actually get, considering you're going to be, guys are going to be rostering both quarterbacks in that game. You're definitely going to have Cooper and Crabtree on a lot of rosters. So what are your thoughts on Cook this week, Pat?
Yeah, I definitely think that he's in play. He's going to have high ownership. That primetime game on Sunday night, people like to see the green screen go up on Sunday night. So I think there's always going to be a little bit higher ownership on those guys. So whether it's Cousins, Carr, Crabtree, Cooper, or even Jared Cook, you're just going to see a little bit of inflated ownership on them. And for that reason, if I can find a reason to fade them, I do. But I think that game with a 54-point total, I think you're fine with any of the plays in that game, really.
Yeah, definitely. Steve, are we limiting our pool to those couple of guys for tight ends this week, or are you looking at anybody else? Because I got one more left.
Yeah, I think you can pay up for Kelsey if you're going to go up even further than that and want to differentiate yourself from Ertz. We saw his usage go back way up. And the Chargers do have a couple of really good cornerbacks that can potentially limit Tyreek Hill. So I do think Kelsey at 6K could be a solid option, and a 47.5 over-under as well. So that'd be my one differentiator. Other than that, it's kind of looking pretty barren again at tight end.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big Delaney Walker fanboy, so I just pulled up FanShare as well, and he has basically nobody's talked about him. I guess one person said that he's a bad play this week, and nobody else has mentioned him at all. So nothing to go crazy on. Obviously, he does have, I mean, a reasonably difficult matchup, though. He is at home. Seattle's coming across the country. And they have it's a pretty low total, which is not something that I love for tight ends. But I think for a GPP dart, he should see a reasonable amount of targets, with sort of not confusion, but with Matthews and everything else that's going on in the receiver core. Murray is banged up, and so Henry fits in. There's a lot of moving parts here, and it might be Mariota just looking for somebody that he's comfortable with a little bit more often than not, in my opinion.
Corey Davis isn't playing either, so that's
that's who. That's not Matthews, Davis. So yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting play. You're not going 30% on them or anything, just a couple of lineups here and there. So let's we can do our cursory. Here's a couple of defenses, and get into some stacks, and then just watch Todd Gurley be Emmitt Smith apparently.
Yep.
For the rest of the night. So is there just an absolute cash lock on D this week for you, Steve?
I think the Eagles, man. Like, I hate to beat up on the Giants, but until they can show me they can play an ounce of offense for 3K, I'll take the Eagles all day with that pass rush, ball hawking secondary, and solid special teams unit. I think they can get to double digits pretty easily against that awful Giants offensive line.
I know it's true, but it doesn't hurt any less, Steve.
I know.
Pat, how about you?
Yeah, I think it's the Eagles for me as well. The expensive defenses really aren't doing it for me this week, and I think when the salaries came out, I wanted to see where the Eagles were, just based on how bad Eric Flowers is. To be honest, he's allowing, and when you can get that kind of pressure on the quarterback, it creates turnovers, and that's when we get the touchdown that you need from a defense.
I mean, again, as a Giants fan, it pains me, but there's nothing going on there. I mean, you just watch Ziggy Ansah just go around, go through, go under, go over Eric Flowers all night the other night, and you're just like, all right, well, this is the Phillies probably good for 4 or 5 sacks, I would think, at least this week, based on how the offensive line has played so far. So I'm fully in on that. So as we wrap up here, why don't we hit some stacks that we're looking at for this week? I guess I can start with something that we already mentioned. I think Simeon to Thomas or Sanders. You can put it either way you want, but I think that that's going to be an interesting sort of lower owned, overlooked game. And obviously Simeon has been playing well, and you have one of the easiest to predict target shares in Denver with really just those two options, unless Benny Fowler wants to score a touchdown again. Because of course that's probably going to happen now that I said this. But what's one that you're looking at, Steve?
I'm really digging the Matthew Stafford, Golden Tate, and then run it back with Julio. Just think that the game's going to be an absolute shootout in Detroit. Fast track indoors. Stafford and Tate are both reasonably priced this week. And then, like I said, you can pay up for Julio in the GPP especially. So I'm digging that one.
Great. And Pat, how about yourself?
Yeah, I think I'm, to be honest, I usually like to find a low-owned stack. And you could always create a low-owned stack just based on the combinations that you make from a game. But I think I'm going to keep my my exposure to those two higher total games this week in Atlanta and Detroit. So I'll have a lot of, like Steve said, Matt Ryan, Julio, Golden Tate, or Matt Ryan, Julio, Marvin Jones. But the one that I think will be a little bit lower owned is Andy Dalton. I think it's the third time I mentioned him on this show alone, and I just think that he's in a good spot with AJ Green, with the new offensive coordinator, and then you could just run it back with different pieces of the Packers offense.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a solid play. So if we're looking at, the only problem with liking Philly's D this week is you don't really have a running back to stack with them. Is it even worth throwing in Sproles with a stack with the D? Probably not, right? I mean,
no,
that seems suboptimal.
Yeah, because I mean, if you think about it, I really don't know if Philly is going to limit the Giants points wise. I mean, I'm sure the Giants aren't going to score a boatload of points, but you're really taking Philly because I think their chance of scoring on defense is pretty high. Mm-hmm. So when you say you're going to stack a running back in a defense, you're thinking about like a grinding the clock carry type guy. So maybe Ajayi and the Dolphins. If you think of some other high total games, maybe Gillislee and the Pats defense wouldn't be too bad. Maybe you're hoping for another multi-touchdown game from Gillislee, but when you have a team that just throws all day like the Eagles, it's really not a spot for you to stack a running back there.
Thought to Hunt, or are we thinking that that's going to go a little too, the game is going to go a little bit too out of, too high scoring for that to be worth it? Steve, what are your thoughts there?
Say that one more time.
With Hunt and KC, what are you thinking that's a viable stack this week, or?
No, I think the Chargers, especially in catch-up mode, I mean, they showed against Denver just how quickly they can strike if they have to. So I think that total might be a bit too high, even with the potential for that double dip with Tyreek and scoring a special teams touchdown. And even though Hunt's one of the best plays on the board, I think LA is just, their offense is too powerful. Yeah,
absolutely. All right. Well, thanks so much for coming on tonight, Pat. Again, you can find him on RotoViz. You can find his videos about exposure on Roster Coach, and he's on Twitter at PatJamesDFS. Really appreciate you coming on, man.
Thanks for having me, guys. Matt, I just want to say one thing. Yeah. When I see you on DraftKings, I think that you're the Duke guard, Matt Jones. That's who I thought of when I first saw that. So I was kind of disappointed to see that you're a white guy with red hair.
You have no idea how many mentions I get during basketball season, because it's, and it was my on Instagram too. My lucky number is 13, and his number was 13, so it was
that's why.
Just out of control. Like people, like commenting and tagging me and stuff as like Duke fans. It's so funny.
Before I saw you before I knew who you were, like maybe like last year or so, I'd see that screen name in the lobby and think, man, he might get in trouble for playing DraftKings as an amateur athlete. What's he doing?
Just getting my eligibility all screwed up, right? I think I still have a couple years of eligibility, so I guess I guess my dreams of going back and being a punt returner for Syracuse are all gone now. All right, well, yeah, thanks again, man. We really appreciate you coming on.
Yeah.
This was fun. You were the first guest, so you're the brave one to start off NFL with us. So we really appreciate it.
All right. Well, I started the bar low, so everybody else can outperform. Thanks for having me, guys.
No problem.
Thanks, Pat.
All right, guys, that'll do it for this week. Again, you can find me on Twitter at MattJonesTFR. You can find Steve at The Real Halupka. And good luck this week, guys. See ya.